Hello and good morning friends, welcome to the CEC-UGC live lecture. Dear friends, as you know that we are carrying a series on gender studies and very successfully we have conducted 4 sessions till now. Dear friends, in today's session we would be talking on gender and ethnicity, and I would like to tell you all we would be conducting this lecture in 2 halves. In the first half we would be talking on understanding ethnicity, and in the second half we would be discussing on ethnic inequality and gender inequality. And for this we have once again with us Dr. Archana Prasad. Dr. Archana Prasad is Assistant Professor in Department of Sociology, Kamala Nehru College, University of Delhi. So dear friends, let's welcome our guest Dr. Archana Prasad, under whose able guidance we would be discussing in detail gender and ethnicity. Hello ma'am, welcome to the EduSet lecture.
Thank you. So continuing with the series of understanding stratification and inequality, today's lecture is on gender and ethnicity. Just as we have heard in the previous lecture, understanding of caste and gender, the understanding of gender and class, today we see how inequality is doubled or tripled in the case when it comes to ethnic community or ethnic groups. So the lecture consists of 2 parts. Part 1, we try to understand the concept of ethnicity, because it's a common parlance, it is quite a time confused with large number of terms like race, terms like nationality, terms like religious group. In sociology, there is a clear-cut distinction between trying to understand what is ethnicity, and when we try to understand ethnicity, we need to try to understand a large number of concepts like prejudice, discrimination, ethnic cleansing, in order to actually understand how deep rooted the problem of ethnic inequality is. And ethnic inequality, which is a part of this part 2 of the lecture, is not a problem which is only taking part in the Indian context, but it is a global phenomena. So we try to understand in the system of stratification, which is a system based on inequality. It is prevalent in all society on the basis of caste, class, gender, race, ethnicity. Each of this, that is caste, class, gender, in itself is a system of stratification, in itself leads to unequal distribution and access to resources. That is, in terms of your position in these strata or in these hierarchy, you get access to resources and goods, and this in turn, the differential access to resources and allocation leads to discrimination and inequality. So at the same time, there is an intersection in the sense that they work along with each other, they work together. That is how caste and gender works together to further discriminate and subordinate women. Similarly, class and gender works together, and here in today's lecture we see how ethnicity is going to work and doubly marginalize women from the ethnic groups. Race and sex are both biological category, they are genetically defined, whereas both of them has a social meaning, that is, it becomes relevant only when certain meaning it is attached in terms of norms, stereotypes and certain ways of behavior. So as a category they are not problem, but when a meaning is attached to it, it becomes symbolically a system of stratification and hierarchy. Norms and stereotypes legitimizes white. Here white would imply a ethnic group. Often the male control, undervaluing men and women of subaltern groups, that is those who are from the lower bottom of the society, and white women. So there is a multiple level of intersection which works together to marginalize and discriminate certain categories of people, and this leads to a kind of a power relation between the dominant group and those which are the subordinate groups. Caste, class, gender and ethnicity are basis of group formation. That is, on the basis of these criteria, a group is formed, and the problem is that when these groups are formed, it becomes a distinctive identity, and often it leads to a clash between 2 different groups. Sociologists have frequently distinguished between different types of groups. So we have a racial group. A racial group is a set in terms of the physical attributes, for example, the color of the skin, the hair, the physical texture, that is versus the black versus the white. We have an ethnic group. The ethnic is set apart because of the national origin of cultural distinctiveness. Example of ethnic group are Karen and Kachin in Burma, Nagas and Tripuras in India. Then we have a minority group, which is a subordinate group whose members have significantly less control over their own lives. Many a time, a race, ethnic, gender could be criteria for becoming a minority group, not necessarily in terms of the numbers of these of the members of the group, but in terms of the power relation, that is, the members of such groups have less power compared to the others. Racial and ethnic groups can become minority groups whereby the discrimination doubles. The formation of groups on basis of physical appearance often accompanies prejudice and discrimination. That is, there are certain kind of stereotypes, mindset that works together in order to increase the level of subordination or to increase the level of discrimination against members of these groups. Now, when we try to understand what is actually ethnicity, ethnicity and ethnic groups are delivered from a Greek word called ethnos, normally translated as nation. The term ethnicity refers currently to people thought to have common ancestry who share a distinctive culture. Initially, in the primitive society, when there was no formation of nation state, nation in terms of a political institution having state, territory and the people, it was considered that ethnicity and nationality was synonymous. But since the 19th century, with the formation of nation state, there is a difference between ethnicity and nationality. A nation can have multiple ethnic groups. From 14th century till 19th century, the term was used for nation. Today, the reference is more to immigrants and indigenous people, that is, those who are not the original inhabitant of certain area or territory are generally assumed to be an ethnic group. Within the social sciences, the usage has become more generalized to all human groups that explicitly regard themselves and are regarded by others as culturally distinctive. So, culture becomes a point of distinction between the two groups, and that becomes the mark of your ethnicity. The term ethnicity refers to groups characterized by common language, culture or nationality. In other words, ethnicity relates to category used to describe groups to which individuals belong or with which they identify. The categories do not denote scientific or anthropological origin. That is, it does not have any kind of an anthropological understanding of how you would trace back the origin of different groups. Ethnicity refers to selected cultural characteristics such as language, lifestyle, religion, food and origin used to classify people into groups or categories considered to be significantly different from others. Ethnicity is a biological concept, but it is not necessarily passed genetically from one generation to another. It is constructed. So, just as gender is a social construct, just as gender is constructed in the cultural realm, that is by giving a certain meaning to the behavior of man and women, by assigning certain set of roles, we construct gender. Similarly, ethnicity is constructed, that is certain prejudice, certain ways of thinking, certain ways of understanding of one group is constructed in order to differentiate between two groups. It is important not to confuse minority with ethnic groups, because it is not necessarily that every time an ethnic group is a minority group. It could be a ethnic group could be a majority as well. Whether a group is a majority or a minority is not an absolute fact. It depends on the perspective. For example, in California, whites are minority, because there is a large population of Asian, Hispanic, African American, because America or United States has seen a large scale of immigration over a period of time. We see people from different ethnic background being a part of the nation, and that is what, where the original inhabitant could become a minority compared to the other inhabitants. When we try to understand the characteristics of ethnicity, we see there are certain important characteristics. One, peoplehood. It refers to shared feeling of attachment to other group members. The feeling could be due to common ancestry, experience of victimization or shared aspiration. So, it could be biologically that belonging to the same kinship group, or you could be a subject to large scale violence and therefore you have a shared feeling of victimization, or you could have a certain ambition and goals as a group and therefore you belong as one unit. The second characteristic is territoriality, that is geographical area. Different ethnic groups occupy or inhabited different geographical territory and that becomes a distinctive marker from one group to the other. Third is culture, shared beliefs, practices, common culture, language and religion. And to understand ethnicity, we also sociologists have used the term ethnocentrism. So, as the term ethnocentrism itself says that you have certain kind of a feeling, you have a certain kind of bias towards your own group, or towards you have certain misconception that one group is superior to the other. Ethnocentrism could lead to a question of violence, could lead to a conflict between two ethnic groups. Then the next characteristic of ethnicity is ascribed membership. In social sciences, we try to understand two kinds of status, ascribed and achieved. Ascribed implies that it is by birth and achieved means it is on the virtue of your capacity to acquire a status. In the stratification system, caste and ethnicity are ascribed status, whereas class is an achieved status. So, in this context of ethnicity, we see it is ascribed because it is a biological factor which is assigned to an individual by birth. In social sciences, to understand ethnicity, we have two perspectives. Why? Because it is important not to understand ethnicity as a fact, but to understand how the markers, that is how ethnic attributes or characteristics are used to mark one group from the other. In this context, we see there are many contributions to the understanding of ethnicity, and most significant has been the contribution of Max Weber. Weber says that ethnic groups are human groups that entertain a subjective belief in their common descent because of similarity of physical type or customs or both, or because of memories of colonization and migration. And then we have two perspectives. One is a cultural approach. The cultural approach focuses more on the customs, beliefs, norms, values. According to the cultural approach, ethnicity would refer to a belief in shared cultural values and practices. Ethnic group identified in terms of shared language, rituals, customs and institutions. So, a group of people who are sharing the same cultural pattern or cultural lifestyle would be considered to belong to a particular ethnic group. This conception is based on a functionalist view that people need a sense of belonging to sustain in times of difficulty, because you need to identify yourself in terms of belonging to a particular group where the membership becomes crucial, especially in the time of crisis where you need certain members to be supportive to the members of other members of the group and therefore be able to come out of the crisis. And in this perspective, ethnicity is not fixed. It implies that over a period of time, ethnicity is subject to change. The next perspective is a political perspective. Political perspective refers to political awareness and mobilization of a group on ethnic basis. And here the question of identity becomes very significant. It is on the question of your identity of belonging to a particular group that you try to be a part of the political institution. That is, you could be gaining political superiority, and over the period of time politics has become based on certain groups' identity, whether it be caste based politics, religion based politics or ethnic based politics. Often when it is on the question of group identity, it could lead to certain kind of discrimination, whereas the apparatus or political institution is supposed to be based on principles of equality, but when one group is given preference to the other, it could lead to question of discriminating those who are minorities or those who have less power access. It results in conflict between the minority and majority. Ethnicity is interest based. That is, if it is a question of trying to participate in the political process on the basis of the origin or on the basis of the identity of a group, then it becomes interest based, and ethnic groups are interest groups. With the whole process of globalization, there are large number of perspective in social sciences which says that the awareness or the feeling towards ethnic identity has increased, whereas it should have been on the other, the reverse, where it is becoming global, where the differences should have been done away. The whole idea of becoming conscious of one's group, or the whole idea of sense of belonging to a particular group has increased with the increase of the whole process of economic globalization and changes in the economic social structure. Now, when we try to see what ethnicity is, we see ethnicity is in terms of a common ancestry, in terms of shared culture, in terms of sharing certain life chances, in terms of having a common political aspiration. We also try to understand what ethnicity is not, and in that sense we see that we most of the time assume that ethnicity is synonymous with a large number of other group, a cultural group. That is, in terms, because it is a shared group, all cultural groups are not necessarily ethnic group. A racial group, it is necessary to differentiate between race and ethnicity. A minority group, minority could be in terms of numerical strength, because for instance in India the Muslim could be a minority in compared to the population of the Hindu, but it could be a question of power relation. When we look into women, the women need not necessarily be less in number, but obviously in the question of power she has limited or less power compared to men. It's an ancestral group, could be old inhabitant or recent migrants. It's an immigrant group and people unlike ourselves. So, these are some of the ways in which ethnicity has been understood, and therefore, we will see in the following sessions how ethnic group is different from race, from nationality and from religion. It is very significant in sociology to differentiate one category from the other, because the moment we subsume them to be into one category, we leave out the minute details of inequality and discrimination. When we try to understand race and ethnicity, we see race and ethnicity are related concepts in that both are defined in terms of genealogy. A race is a human population that is believed to be distinct in some way from other human based on real or imagined physical differences. And the most evident criteria of differentiating race is the color of the skin, where we have the difference between the white and the black. Ethnicity also connotes shared linguistic cultural behavior or religious trait. Race, by contrast, refers to some concentration of some hereditary particles and physical characteristics which appears, fluctuates and often disappears in the course of time by reason of geographical and or cultural isolation. So, to be very in commonsensical, race is a biological concept, whereas ethnic is a cultural concept. So, we are born with certain biological attributes which over a period of cultural assimilation, cultural interaction can undergo change, and that could be result into an ethnic group. Ethnicity, while related to race, refers not only to physical characteristics but also social traits that are shared by human population. And this is a point which is very significant in sociology, because what is significant in understanding inequality or understanding system of stratification is the social attributes which is assigned, or the cultural meaning that we attach to a phenomena. So, by itself race is not problematic. The moment we attach certain kind of meaning based on certain stereotypes or certain assumption, it leads to a certain kind of unequal relation, and this leads to subordination and further discrimination. Race is socially defined on the basis of physical biological criteria, whereas ethnicity is socially defined on the basis of cultural criteria. So, the cultural criteria for defining ethnicity are common ancestry, cultural heritage, language, nation of origin. Ethnic differences lead to a host of problems, stereotypes, prejudice, discrimination and racism. While race and ethnicity are different, the two may go together when groups share not only physical trait but also ethnic traits. For example, Korean American or Native American. So, as we differentiate between ethnicity and nationalism, it is important to differentiate between ethnicity and the nation. A nationality is an identity with a group of people who share legal attachment and personal allegiance to a particular country. So, it is on the basis of your citizenship that you arrive a certain kind of feeling to the territory to which you belong. You have a certain kind of pride in belonging to the country, which in a political language refers to nation. A nation or nationality is a group of people tied to a particular place through legal status and cultural tradition. Ethnicity describes cultural identity, while nationality describes political identity. And it is not necessarily that all the time ethnicity and political identity are same. It could be different, and especially in a situation where the nation is multi-ethnic, it is necessary to differentiate between the idea of nationality and ethnicity. America is a nationality. Hispanic American or African American are ethnicity, and race is genetic heritage, with skin color being most visible trait. So, in the situation of America, we see that the race would be the white and the black. Ethnicity is cultural tradition, whereas nationalism is feeling of patriotic or feeling of political relation to a country. In the understanding of ethnicity and religion, we see the same kind of distinction, where ethnicity implies sharing of common heritage, ancestry, language, culture, which we have already understood. Religion refers to set of beliefs and practices concerning cause and purpose of the universal. Many believe in the supernatural, many do not believe in supernatural. For many believe in religion, it is a way of life. Whereas ethnic group implies understanding on a common language, shared culture. Religious groups are Christians, Muslims, Hindus, where ethnic groups are African Americans, where the Native Americans, Arab, Kurds, Persian, Turks, these are all ethnic group. By sharing a common religion, people can belong to the same ethnic group, but by sharing the same religion, it is not necessarily that you belong to the same ethnicity. What is very important to understand is the concept of ethnic identity, because it is a question of significance where it leads to understanding of distinctiveness between two ethnic groups. Identity means making sense of how we see ourselves. Ethnicity gives a sense of identity to individuals and groups. Ethnicity is increasingly important means by which states and scientists can identify. It is used as an apparatus for sorting people, for identifying people into different categories. It is not physical characteristics that identify a group, but how social relationships determine the feeling of belonging to each other. Is a more complex issue in countries that are multi-ethnic, and that is where it becomes a question of violence, or it becomes a question of ethnic conflict, where the feeling of one group or the identity that I belong to one group is more superior to the identity of the other group, often leads to a whole understanding of ethnic conflict and ethnic violence. So, when try to understand in the whole understanding of ethnicity, we see what ethnicity is, how it leads to group formation. It is a certain kind of identity, it is a certain kind of belonging to a group. We need to differentiate between ethnicity and a large number of related concepts like race, nationalism, and religion. And many a time what happens is that nationalism and religion often blurs the boundary, and it becomes a ground of difference and conflict between two different groups. In this session, we are trying to understand the whole understanding of how gender and ethnicity intersect to lead to certain kind of discrimination and inequality. But before we try to understand what is ethnic inequality or how gender intersects with ethnic violence, we try to understand a large number of related concepts which would become relevant in understanding ethnic inequality and gender violence. So, we try to understand the whole understanding of minority and majority, and we understand minority and majority in terms of collective of people. For example, women, Native Americans, African American, Hispanic American, that is assigned a low social position. This low social position reflects oppression, suppression and discrimination. So, it is not only a simple ranking, but it is a hierarchy. So, when hierarchy implies that you have certain level of status which is assigned to the strata, which becomes a question of differential. So, in a question of political participation, maybe majority have more access to political apparatus than compared to minority, and therefore, it leads to certain kind of inequality. For understanding ethnic inequality, what is very important to concept is prejudice. Prejudice is the tendency of an individual to think about the other group in negative ways. That is, you try to understand your group as having certain superior quality and the other group as being inferior or being incapable of doing certain action. Because of negative opinion, the behavior is of contempt. So, you look down upon the other group, you look with arrogance, disgust. For example, there are a large number of stereotypes which would say the blacks are lazy, the Jews are stingy. So, it is full of certain kind of stereotypical thinking about certain groups, and there is no biological or scientific basis on which the stereotypes could work. Another related concept with prejudice is discrimination. Discrimination is defined as the unequal treatment of a person or persons based on group membership. So, because you are a member of one group, you have access to certain resources, you have access to power relation, and because you are a member of another group, you are denied the resources, you do not have any power. So, that is a question of discriminating. So, a group is discriminated from the other based on the idea of caste, class and ethnicity. An example is not hiring a person because of his membership of any particular group. In the situation of caste system, we see how the members of the lower caste would not be as used as say priest in the temple, or for instance when apartheid was not a part of the American culture, black would not be given a certain political position just because you are a member of caste or a particular race. Ethnic stratification, that is, all the ethnic groups are arranged in certain kind of a strata. These stratas are not simple ranking or these are not simple arrangement, but these are again based on the prejudice, based on certain stereotypes, that certain groups are given higher status and other groups are considered as subordinate. Racism. Racism is a belief about the superiority of one racial group compared to the other ethnic group. For during the colonial period, we see the colonizers, that is the Britishers, would have a certain kind of attitude towards the brown skin or maybe towards the Asian, which is again becomes a question of violence or question of conflict in many parts of the world. It is often rooted on the assumption that there is a genetic difference and there is a certain biological difference, or certain groups do not have the capacity to do certain acts, certain tasks, and therefore they should be considered as subordinate and they should not be considered at a higher position. Genocide. Genocide is again when it takes place at the time of ethnic violence. The whole idea is to exterminate, or that is to bring an end to a certain groups by doing large amount of violence on that groups. Ethnic cleansing. Ethnic cleansing is to terrorize an ethnic group, that is to commit so much of violence on a group that the group becomes scared and finally it disappears from a certain area. to terrorize an ethnic group and induce its members to flee from a given area, thereby leading the area in possession of the attackers. So, it is again a power relation. Those who have dominance, those who have power will be able to commit violence on the subordinate and ensure that the subordinate group or the minority groups are out from that locality or territory. For example, a large number of paramilitary forces or the state uses the violence or rape on women in order to ensure that it is clean of certain ethnic group. Ethnic inequality. Ethnic inequality is the political economic disadvantage felt by racial minority groups. Inequality affects two main groups of ethnic minority population: long-term settled community, which often predate the boundaries of nation state by many centuries. So, before the nation or state would come in, these are the original inhabitants and they were the original occupant of the certain areas. But since globalization or the nation states got formed, there were other migrant group that came in, and therefore, there is a difference between the earlier inhabitant and the other groups. More recent minority population, for example, there is a large scale immigration to other countries, and therefore, the population that immigrates would be in a situation of discrimination to the original population of the country. For example, in Bangladeshi people in Britain you have large scale discrimination against the Asian, and it is a basis of ethnic inequality and often leads up into ethnic conflict. Ethnic inequality can be within the group. Within an ethnic group you have inequality that could be again on the basis of your class on your basis of gender, but most of the time the ethnic inequality is based on the discrimination of two different ethnic groups. Now, we try to understand how ethnicity is gendered, because gender cannot be analyzed outside of ethnic, national and race relations, and neither can these later phenomena be analyzed without gender. It is not a case of simply adding these two sets of analysis together, but rather they mutually affect each other in a dynamic relation, and this is the contribution of gender studies to the entire discipline, to the entire ways of problematizing how gender always intersects in relation to nation, in relation to race, and that is how it will be able to understand the structured inequality which has really subordinated certain categories of women on the basis of certain group membership and certain identity. Discrimination experienced because of gender, for example, gender discrimination against women. So, you have a preference for a son, so there is a female feticide. This is a basic gender discrimination. Gender discrimination can be affected by ethnicity, that is when a woman is from a certain ethnic community, the level of discrimination would be double than it would be from the other community. Women are always carriers, are markers of identity, and this is to understand how women has been symbolized. They are symbols of culture, they are symbols of community, they are symbols of nation. So, their own agency is absent. You only look at women with reference to your race, community and nation, and at that point of time when there is a question of preference, obviously nation and community becomes significant than the gender identity. Women are supposed to maintain ethnic differences, just as we have seen in the understanding of caste and gender, that women play a significant role in maintaining the purity of the caste system. Similarly, we see in ethnic differences, the whole responsibility of maintaining the identity of an ethnic group is on the women. Gender issues figured prominently in social construction of boundaries between ethnic groups and local notion of racial purity. So, again it is the onus on the women to maintain the original purity of the race. It is the entire biological or reproductive role of the women which becomes significant as markers of purity and markers of identity of groups. Then structures of family, household and gender vary across ethnic groups. So, each these gender roles, gender norms are not universal. The whole idea of subordination of women is universal, but how the subordination takes place would differ from one ethnic group to the other. Gender roles are different in different ethnic group. The minority status of the ethnic group influences the gendered vulnerability to violence. Minority, immigrant, indigenous women in many societies have limited employment opportunities and often at the bottom of the labor market. So, that is where there is a double or a triple marginalization, that where we look into the economy or when we look into the labor market, we see that the access to the public space for women is less because of her being a women. This becomes extremely more difficult if the woman is from a certain ethnic background or is from a minority group. So, the chances of being in the labor market is extremely influenced, and most of the time it is evident from researches that it is the women from the minority groups who are at the lower level of the class hierarchy. That is, it is hardly to be seen that women from an ethnic minority group would be able to rise up the ladder to become the head of corporate sector or be at a high position. So, these intersectional gender and ethnic identity or caste identity works together to prevent the mobility of the women in the labor market. Ethnic or race-based violence again women is considered the most recognizable example of an intersection. That is, when we look into the understanding of how women's body becomes significant for understanding of the conflict or community conflict or religious conflict, where the body is only seen as a commodity or is only seen as a kind of a property that belongs to a community or to a nation, which could be subject to any kind of violence, becomes problematic in understanding gender relation. Disadvantages faced by minority women in the labor market, trafficking in women and race-based violence against women. So, these are some of the instances of where the intersection between the different levels of stratification works. Then we try to understand inequality based on gender and ethnicity. There are large areas where ethnicity and gender share a large common similarities in terms of understanding gender inequality. Gender and ethnicity are both external markers, that is, in terms of your physical attributes, you are able to differentiate between different kind of categories of people. For example, the whole idea of women's physical appearance is different from a man's body. Similarly, in the case of race, a white man would be different in physical appearance to a black man. So, both gender and race are biological, based on biological attributes and on which meanings are assigned by the culture and by the society. Both are points of reference. So, you refer to a group on the basis of your race and gender identity, and both are ways of which you sort people, that is, you classify people. So, there is a gender segregation where women are grouped into one and men are grouped into the other. Gender and ethnicity are recognized as two of the leading axes of marginality. That is, that both are, though the members of both the groups are on the margin. One on the basis of your physical, genetical attributes of having certain physical appearance, and two in the terms of the categorization which the society has done. So, both are social constructs. So, the biology does not end, biology is not destiny. Both in terms of ethnic relation and in terms of gender, there is a meaning which is attached to it, and therefore, you try to understand a natural phenomena in terms of a cultural setting. The black is different from white, it seems as natural and self-evident, but the meaning that we give to black and white is social, and when we differentiate or we discriminate between black and white, becomes a social inequality or basis of stratification between the two groups. Both look different. A woman is supposed to shorter than man, weaker, but also dress, walk, speak, gesticulate differently. So, there are certain markers which are identified to with members of the each group. Both ethnic minority and women also attributed with other qualities that are not obvious. So, there are certain kind of assumptions which are taken to structure the relation between members of these groups. Both women and ethnic groups have high visibility, that is, on the basis of your physical appearance, on your physical attributes, the distinction between the two, biological distinction, is very clear. However, the cultural meaning which is assigned and the meaning which is used to discriminate these groups are most of the time invisible. On what criteria a certain groups is prohibited or inhibited from entering certain area has no cultural explanation. In both the case of women and ethnic minority, the tendency of the dominant section of the society is to attribute qualities as naturally given, biologically endowed. It is important to state that the ethnic group in question of women are compliant in accepting a self-definition socially onto them. So, both at the time there is a certain kind of an understanding that the meaning which has been ascribed has been internalized by the both by the ethnic group as well as the gendered person. So, these structuring or this way in which stratification has been working in the society, there is a certain level of acceptance by the victims themselves. So, the women themselves accepts their subordinate or their position in the domestic sphere. Similarly, the members of the ethnic minority have accepted the inferior or subordinate status, and therefore, they are able to be a part of the power relation, or they are able to accept the domination which is on them. The reason or the explanation why such an internalization has taken place is because of the way in which society functions and the role that members of the society play in trying to socialize the members the younger generation into certain norms, certain stereotypes which are gendered. Women and people of color are more likely to experience economic disadvantage, social exclusion, lack of decision making power, misinterpretation in society, and its extreme violence. So, this is where there is a common experience of both men of the ethnic group and women from the across the group. There are other areas where gender and ethnicity would have similarities, and the area is discrimination and subordination. So, in the course of the lecture, we have understood that both ethnic group and women are subject to discrimination and subordination. So, most of the time ethnic minority is considered as a subordinate group. Similarly, women are considered subordinate to men. Prejudice and stereotypes. So, there is a certain level of functioning of the society in which certain prejudice and stereotypes are working to keep these people into a subordinate position. So, from a feminist perspective, we try to see that it is a question of power relation. So, those who are on the dominant position continue through prejudice, through discrimination, through stereotypes, maintain or retain their power position and continue to subordinate the group which are considered as inferior. So, these are all mechanisms to keep the power relation in place. Then both are question of identity. So, we have seen how gender is a question of how you become aware of yourself, whether you are feminine or a masculine. Similarly, ethnicity is a question of your ethnic marker, that to which group you belong. Both are minority groups. Both gender and ethnicity has following similar trajectory. First, as fundamental social markers, gender, race, ethnicity structures relation of production, whether it is women subsiding capital through overrepresentation in unpaid reproductive labor or people of color being overrepresented in low paying menial job. Second, both gender and ethnicity represents groups that are peripheral to the status order of the society. Both women and people of color are found wanting in relation to dominant norms such as rationality, individualism, competitiveness that are valorized in Western and masculinist value system. So, you have certain ideas about the dominant group. that the dominant group has certain characteristics which becomes a question of aspiration for the subordinate groups. So, members of the ethnic group as well as women always aspire to adopt the features which would be considered to be significant in attaining power relation. So, masculinity would be given a more significance, and there is a tendency to accept the attributes of masculinity and somewhere demean femininity because it leads to an inferior status. Similarly, in the case of ethnic groups, certain ethnic groups are considered to be superior. So there is a tendency to adopt the lifestyle or to adopt the culture of the dominant group and give their own. So it leads to a certain kind of denial of certain practices which are assumed to be inferior compared to the attributes of the dominant group. Then we come to ethnic conflicts. Because ethnicity is a question of identity, it is a question of group membership, and it is based on whole idea of prejudice stereotypes, it leads to certain kind of conflicts. Ethnic conflicts are conflicts in which the goal of at least one conflict party are defined exclusively in ethnic terms, and which the primarily fault line of confrontation is one of the ethnic distinction. So, the most of the time the conflict is in terms of attaining certain identity which is considered to belong to one group and not to the other. Ethnic conflicts often arise in reaction to prejudice or discriminatory action, are consequence of organized communal bodies supported by political party. This is a feature of the modern contemporary society where most of the time politics is being practiced, or the politics has become a question of power game, and many a time the minorities are used in order to fulfill the interest of a political party, and that is where ethnic interest and political interest would merge, and many a time it is utilized. It becomes a kind of a communal violence when one is at a loggerhead with the other. Factors for ethnic conflict are: one, groups feel oppressed because of less political power and rights; clash of ethnicity and religion; territorial disputes; control of resources. In India, the ethnic conflicts have had communal rights, communal color, because most of the time religion has become significant in terms of the conflict between the Hindus and Muslims since the time India gained independence. And over the years it has continued. The history of India is full of ethnic or communal violences at different parts of the country. So, we see the Babri Masjid demolition, we see civil war in Kashmir, violence in northeast, and there are other instances where ethnic conflict is significant. In other parts of the country, we see the ethnic conflicts taking place in Bosnia, Kosovo, Timor, Rwanda and Cambodia. Now, what is important to understand ethnic conflict is to understand the situation of women in ethnic conflict, and this is a serious issue in gender studies, because it is the way in which women are symbolized and where the women's body becomes significant, and the whole identity, the agency of women are denied. So, during conflict, multiple binary construction in the sense that they are dual or opposite construction, that is masculine versus feminine, within a group versus outside a group, our women, their women. So, our women becomes you need to protect our women, whereas you need to commit violence on other women. So, the identity of women as a homogeneous group becomes problematic. Our men versus their men. Our women are chaste, honorable to be protected. Their women are unchaste, depraved and deserving degradation. That is, it is the society which is manipulating the attributes which has been assigned to the women. So, when you are a symbol of your own culture, you are supposed to be chaste, you are supposed to be having the attributes of feminine, but when you are considered as other women, or when you are women that do not belong to the ethnic group, then you are unchaste, and you are considered as degradable, and you have no identity of your own. Roles as biological and cultural reproducers, signifiers of ethno-national differences, etc., mean they are targeted in attempt to dominate or destroy a collectivity. The female body is symbolic representation of the politics. Intersection between gender and ethnicity. So, the ethnic violence is one situation where the intersection becomes very visible. Gender as a category of analysis and conflict situation of ethnic nature offers an interesting tool to understand the dynamic of conflict vis-a-vis women. This helps us to understand the ways in which gender differences are constructed, translated in social groups and institutions. So, how you understand what contributes or what is a feminine attribute completely undergoes a change in the situation of a conflict. Women's experience of conflict are fundamentally different from men because of sexist culture of devaluing femininity. So, the whole idea of masculinity as denoting power it becomes significant, where femininity as inferior, femininity as having no identity of its own can be subject to manipulation by the culture. Most of the time, armed conflicts are instances where gender roles and differences change. Cultural and ethnic norm create spaces of modesty and immodesty. A line is drawn between permitted and forbidden space and between the space of purity and impurity. So, the entire space is gendered. So, your mobility of the women would be subject to restriction, and that is again decided by the custodians of the culture, which is the men. Men as cultural guard of society makes these boundaries. So, they are the ones who have power in their hand, and they decide who is a chaste woman, who is an unchaste woman. They decide where the women are supposed to move. They decide what is going to happen to the body of the women. So, they take on the role because they have dominant position. They subordinate the women not only in terms of controlling her body and controlling her sexuality, but also impinging violence on the body. So, gender-based violence is a very significant part of conflict situation, where large number of violence are committed by the state, by the military on the women, just as a mark of punishment to the entire community. So, right from the independence struggle or with the time when India was partitioned, a large number of women were raped by the and not by the different nation, and there the identity of whether you are belong to one nation becomes more significant than whether you are a woman and you deserve protection. So, there is large number of examples from across the country, across the globe, where we see that rape becomes a symbol of violence, or the body becomes significant, where a large number of women have been subject to certain kind of violence. The purpose of mass rape in conflict are means of dehumanizing and terrorizing civilians, population into submission. So, you need the group to come into submission, you impinge violence on the women. Women are abducted and they are used as slaves. Genocide, ethnic cleansing are all part of the violence on women, where women becomes significant markers. So, what is important to understand that the women are not only used at the time of conflict, but they become very significant, and the attributes of femininity as representing peace becomes significant when you have to ensure that conflict comes to an end. So, there is a paradox: when there is a conflict, the women's body is utilized for punishment, and when there is a question of peace, the women themselves become significant in the process of peacemaking. So, when we try to understand gender and ethnicity, we see that it is a very complex relation, and many a time gender and ethnicity intersect to increase the quantum of violence which is caused on women. With this, we come to an end to the understanding of gender and ethnicity.
With this note, thank you, ma'am. Thank you so very much for giving us a very, very vivacious session where we try to understand about ethnicity. We hope that you might have some questions to be asked. Then you can mail us at info.cc@ic.in. We would love to solve your queries, which you would be sending us through our mail ID. We would be meeting again and would be discussing on another aspect under the series Gender Studies. Till then, take care. Goodbye. Thank you, ma'am. Thank you so very much.